All operations of the emergency alert system. All stations may now resume regular programming.
For expanding its sphere of influence on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
We live in a world where an ever-increasing gulf separates reality and one's experience to it. The masters of perception wield their powers over the unwitting masses. The average person believes that their opinions, worldviews, and choices are their own. However, how many of our positions are in fact genuine, devoid of manipulation? So could it be possible that we are failing to see the hidden hands of manipulation guiding our every move? Well, tonight, we're going to see how far this goes. In regards to behavior modification, social engineering, and manufacturing narratives, there's no better place to start than with the Tavistock Institute.
There is another very important phase of warfare. It has as its target not the body, but the mind of the enemy.
The target of psychological warfare is against the enemy's mind.
It is words and ideas.
Ammunition used by Psywar.
Its mission is to influence the thoughts of the enemy soldier, and at the same time
is expected and encouraged to study foreign languages and the social sciences such as history, economics, and sociology. He must have a broad and sympathetic understanding of all phases of human experience.
Reality management is an informal term referring to the methods used to divorce citizens from actual fact, largely dependent on manufacturing false perceptions that the undiscerning individual confuses with the truth. Now, when you begin looking into the Tavistock Institute, it's almost as if many of the significant movements of change over the past, 100 years or so, including but not limited to music, politics, religion, social reform, and most especially the New Age movement, well, it appears that they are all in relation to a broader agenda. The thing is that shaping cultural movements, when you break things down into strategic pieces, it doesn't really require that much. It's more like just nudging it along. Soft manipulation, creating trends, driving narratives, and aiding in the dissemination of media. Figuring out which headlines motivate, disgust, reinvigorate their base, or shut off their base. It's all been studied and deployed. Now, when trying to break down these concepts, it can really be summed up into a broad psychological mechanism. The agenda is founded on the fact that an individual would rather satiate and indulge themselves in physical and emotional pleasures over facing the truth, which is actually the broader point as to why I felt looking into Aleister Crowley would be a poignant topic. It is very close to what he preached. That's not the only aspect to it though. These forms of manipulation and social engineering only work on a consciousness that has been lulled to sleep, one that chooses not to think critically, question an appearance, or would rather believe a feel-good lie rather than penetrate it to reveal a hard-to-accept truth. And I quote, "The world needs those who can see past social acceptance alone for the pure principles of truth that lead to an objective morality and justice, not moral relativism." And that is a very, very true statement. So let's get into the history. While the Tavistock Institute was not officially formed until 1947, based on what I found, their history can be traced back a little further. Established in 1921 by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, otherwise known as the Chatham House, and I did a whole video delving into their history if you're interested in that. Anyway, the Tavistock Institute has grown into one of the world's biggest and most influential think tanks, working through governments, NGOs, the media, transnational corporations, and major universities in order to manipulate the populations of the world into accepting a one-world collectivist state. Essentially, they wind you up because they know what makes you tick. The Tavistock Clinic studied shell shock in World War I. However, they switched to developing psychological warfare in 1922. Basically, rather than helping traumatized soldiers, they calculated their breaking points so they could recreate it. It is said that the Tavistock shock doctrine now permeates global modern life. And it does appear as if they had ambitions to go global right from the start. The Tavistock Institute sent German-born psychologist Kurt Lewin to MIT in 1945 to establish the Research Center for Group Dynamics. In the US, Lewin is the founder of social psychology. Now, the center did move to the University of Michigan in 1948, where it became the Institute for Social Research, and continued to co-opt legitimate psychological research and exploit mass psychology. Under the guidance of Dr. Kurt Lewin, Tavistock established the OSS, which is the forerunner to the CIA. The Tavistock Institute was behind another major development in providing a detailed study program that led to the creation of the Office of Naval Intelligence. And by the way, is the premier intelligence service in the United States, one that dwarfs the CIA in size and scope. And today, the Tavistock Institute runs more than 30 research institutions in the US. So, promoting creativity in organizational policy, it remains an influential intelligence organization that is still tied to MI6, the CIA, and the Rockefeller Foundation, among others. So, in 1946, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations split off a policy-thinking mother of all think tanks, publicly claiming to research and direct groups and organizations while it continued massive covert operations in social engineering. The founder of the Tavistock Institute, John Rawlings Rees, claimed, and I quote, "Public life, politics, and industry should all be within our sphere of influence. If we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarians and organize some kind of fifth column activity. We must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. We have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The two easiest among them, naturally, are teaching and the church. The two most difficult are law and medicine." Now, former MI6 intelligence officer John Coleman first exposed their covert activities with his insider knowledge in the book entitled The Tavistock Institute: Shaping the Moral, Spiritual, Cultural, Political, and Economic Decline of the U.S. And I quote, "The enemy is clearly identifiable as the Committee of 300, the Club of Rome, NATO, the Council on Foreign Relations, and all of its affiliate organizations. The think tanks and research institutes controlled by Stanford, and last, but certainly not least, the military establishment." Now let's read a section from his book. The Tavistock Institute began as a propaganda creating and disseminating organization centered at the Wellington House, which was where the original organization was put together with the intent of shaping a propaganda outlet. A propaganda outlet that would break down the stiff public resistance being encountered to the looming war between Britain and Germany. The project was given to Lord Rothmere and Northcliffe, and their mandate was to produce an organization capable of manipulating public opinion, but also to direct that manufactured opinion down the desired pathway to support a declaration of war by Great Britain against Germany. Originally, funding was provided by the British royal family and later by the Rothschilds, whom Lord Northcliffe was related through marriage. Arnold Toynbee, who we've talked about previously, was selected as the director of future studies. Two Americans, Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, were appointed to handle the manipulation of American public opinion in preparation for the entry of the U.S. into World War I, but they were also tasked with briefing and directing President Woodrow Wilson. From a somewhat crude beginning at the Wellington House grew an organization that was to shape the destiny of Germany, Britain, and more especially the U.S., in a manner that became a highly sophisticated organization to manipulate and create public opinion, which is commonly termed mass brainwashing. During the course of its evolvement, the Tavistock Institute expanded in size and ambition, when in 1937 a decision was made to use the German author Oswald Spengler's monumental work, entitled The Decline of Western Civilization, as a model. So in 1936, Oswald Spengler's monumental work, The Decline of the West, had come to the attention of what had become the Tavistock Institute, in preparation for changing and reshaping public opinion for the second time in less than 12 years. By unanimous consent of the board, Spengler's massive book was adopted as the blueprint for the new working model. A working model to bring about the decline and fall of Western civilization, which was necessary, in their mind, to create and establish a new world order inside a one-world government. The two world wars cost the German nation almost 1/4 of its population. Most of the intellectual energies of the German nation were diverted into war channels in defense of the fatherland. This was at the expense of science, the arts, literature, music, and the cultural, spiritual, and moral advancement of the nation. The same could be said of the British nation. The blaze kindled by the British under the direction of the Tavistock Institute set all of Europe on fire. Now, the Tavistock Institute by 1937 had come a long way from its Wellington House beginnings and the successful propaganda campaign that had turned the British public from being strongly anti-war in 1913 to willing participants through the art of manipulation. And they did so with the willing cooperation of news communication media. This technique was carried across the Atlantic in 1916 to manipulate the American people to support the war in Europe, in spite of the fact that the vast majority, including at least 50 US senators, were adamantly opposed to the US getting involved in the war. However, the conspirators were undeterred. At that point, the Wellington House introduced the word isolationist as a derogatory description of those Americans who opposed US participation in the war. The use of such words and phrases has proliferated under the expert brainwashing of social science scientists at the Tavistock Institute. They also added terms like regime change and collateral damage to the political vocabulary. With the Tavistock Plan modified to suit American conditions, Bernays and Lippmann led President Woodrow Wilson to set up the very first Tavistock methodology techniques for polling, or what we should call it is the manufacturing of so-called public opinion. They taught Wilson to set up a secret body of quote-unquote managers to run the war effort and a body of advisors to assist the president with his decision-making. And Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to publicly proclaim himself in favor of a socialist New World Order inside a socialist One World government. His remarkable acceptance of the New World Order is found in his book entitled The New Freedom. Now, we say his book, but actually it was written by socialist William Hale. Now, in this book, Woodrow Wilson denounced capitalism, saying, and I quote, "It is contrary to the common man, and it has brought stagnation to our economy." Yet, at the time, I will note that the US economy was enjoying prosperity and industrial expansion as it never experienced before in our history. So, this guy was full of shit right from the start. However, and I quote, "We stand in the presence of a revolution, not a bloody revolution. America is not given to spilling blood, but a silent revolution, whereby America will insist upon recovering to practice those ideals which it has always professed. Upon securing a government devoted to the general and not the special interests, we are upon the threshold of a time when the systematic life of the country will be sustained, or at least supplemented at every point by government activity. And now, we have to determine what kind of government activity it shall be, whether, in the first place, it shall be directed from government itself, or whether it should be indirect, through instrumentalities which have already constituted themselves and which stand ready to supersede government." And that's from Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was the first US president to manage the war through a civilian committee guided and directed by Edward Bernays, the godfather of propaganda. And just a side note, I did a whole video about Edward Bernays as well, so you might want to check that out too. So, the resounding success of the Wellington House and its enormous influence on the course of American history began before that in 1913. Wilson had spent almost a year tearing down the protective trade tariffs that had defended the American domestic markets from being overwhelmed by free trade. Essentially, the practice of allowing cheap British goods made with cheap labor in India to flood the American market. On October 12, 1913, Wilson signed the bill that was the beginning of the end of the unique American middle class, long the target of the Fabian socialists. The bill was described as a measure to quote-unquote adjust tariffs, but it would have been more accurate to describe it as a bill to destroy tariffs. Such was the hidden power of the Wellington House that the vast majority of the American people accepted this lie, not knowing or realizing that it was a death blow for American commerce, and this would eventually lead to NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. Even more astonishing was the acceptance of the Federal Income Tax Act that was passed on September 5, 1913. And part of the manipulation was that Woodrow Wilson called his twin blows against the Constitution and I quote, "a fight for the people and for free business." The Federal Reserve Act was explained by Wilson as a reconstructing of the nation's banking and currency system. The deceptive language of the Federal Reserve Act was under the guidance of Edward Bernays. All this led to was the secured control of people's money and currency and transferred it to a private monopoly without the victim's consent. One of the most interesting pieces of history surrounding the imposition of this foreign financial slavery measure was that before it was sent to Woodrow Wilson for his signature, a copy was given to the sinister Colonel Edward Mandell House as the representative of Wellington House, and the British oligarchy was actually represented by the banker J.P. Morgan. As to the American people, in whose name the disastrous measure was instituted, they had not the faintest idea how they have been connived, cheated, lied to, and utterly deceived. An instrument of slavery was fastened around their necks without the victims ever becoming aware of it, and it was all due to the Tavistock Institute. With that in mind, it appears as though the Tavistock Institute's mission has crept into organizations far beyond its initial purview, and they are scripting our wars, our lives, and our future. Now, I have a question for you. What if everything you were brought up to think about society, all layers of cultural meaning about healing and freedom, are wrong? What if someone was subverting your beliefs, your ideas, your values with behavioral tricks to use them against you? In the world, according to the Tavistock Institute, social drivers are disguised as their exact opposites to create a worldview that is an illusion, reinventing the world in distorted form. And I quote, "The Tavistock Institute invented what you should believe. It is no accident we have become victims of future shock in the long crisis, a battle for your soul. Ego is a mental structure, not an entity separate from the soul. Whether you view it psychologically or spiritually, the soul is structured through ego development with mental forms, words, and images. It can also be fragmented with them. We lose our soul when we lose our dreams." Now, how is the mind bent, and towards what end? Typically, I've realized that the masses are bent through control of resources and the environment, manipulation campaigns through media, crisis, and social turbulence. When you look deeper into these social engineering concepts and those who study them, you find yourself surrounded by strange connections and partnerships. Non-profit foundations have teamed up with corporate, military, and governmental entities to form a control force, for lack of a better term. The art of war became a management problem. Unintended consequences result. Under the guise of prevention, they create oppression. So, cultural psychology was used to assess the enemy mentality. Although they did not stop with the enemy or with rewriting history. They spread their Tavistock method, their theories, their practice of mass manipulation into all strategic institutions. And you have to look at things from both sides of the coin. Once you learn how to organize behavior, which is known as joint optimization, you subsequently also know how to disorganize it as well. When the Tavistock pioneers began exploring the psyche, it was terra incognito, uncharted territory. However, what they found was that modulating someone's internal state is a powerful form of control. They do this by using the power of narrative, imagery, and frequency. Conditioning replaces external constraint with internal compulsions on both essence and substance. And I quote from Arthur Croker, "What we traditionally have meant by human perception, vision, insight, ethical judgment, and discriminating between reality and illusion have been effectively shut down, almost surgically replaced by a virtual vision machine of the militarized imagination. We are suddenly rendered vulnerable to the new virtual myths about the supposedly hygienic character of post-human warfare." Now, really, what the Tavistock did was they took the healing principles of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and aimed it at mass psychology in a really controlling way. And really, if you think about it, it mirrors the early relationship between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who wound up with a 6-year nervous breakdown when Freud essentially brainwashed him. Sigmund Freud displays a pattern of turning his followers into mental cases, and some of them committed suicide. Carl Jung in 1913, Victor Tosk in 1919, Herbert Silbauer in 1923, and William Reich in 1927. What Sigmund Freud did was he broke their personalities down, providing a model that his magical child, the Tavistock Institute, used as a modus operandi on social fronts. The Tavistock Institute began with research on shell shock, post-traumatic stress, propaganda, and applied mind control. They have broken down our whole country with collective ego death. They have used Jung's metaphysics to re-mythologize and spiritualize society, using things like hope and change as just some form of new dope for the new age. Civilizations need a myth to live, irrespective of national sovereignty. The Tavistock Institution's foundation ideology orchestrates archetypal battles of good and evil, and they do so with hopes of nurturing totalitarian ends. Arguably, in doing so, they have distorted civilization, morals, psychology, history, and religion. They have seized a monopoly on human judgment. The depth psychology models of Freud and Jung, the inherent nature of the psyche, and the human response to trauma have been played against our dreams of a better tomorrow. The Tavistock Institute created protocols to deliberately initiate and manipulate breakdowns in both individuals and in the masses. Reinforcing this with media manipulation has created a conformist society. Framing the narrative of world events, it has manufactured history according to its own agenda. And it has done so with a mystique of authority. Through a compartmentalized global network of think tanks and non-profit organizations which promote the same agenda of social engineering, population control, and exploitation, spanning the entire socio-political spectrum, they have spread their shadow over the globe as an uninvited trance. Now again, another Tavistock alumni, Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, turned his understanding of mass psychology into a shameless public relations and advertising juggernaut. He called it consumerism. And I quote from Edward Bernays, "In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by a relatively small number of people who understand the mental process and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." The thing is, covert forces are playing on your unconscious mind. With global hypnosis, they have made themselves into the rudder of the ship of state, setting policy, advising, and dominating governments, corporations, and the educational structure itself. I mean, the short list of Tavistock fellow globalist institutions include the Rockefeller Foundation, the CIA, MI6, the Stanford Research Institute, the Brookings Institute, the Rand Corporation, the Club of Rome, the Council on Foreign Relations, the IMF, the PNAC, the Pilgrim Society, the Wharton School, NASA, and the World Bank. They are inside your head from cradle to grave, using every control mechanism known to behavioral science, creating and fulfilling your desires with programming and emotional manipulation. Everyone senses it on some level, but no one really does anything about it. A quote from James Paul Warburg: "We shall have world government, whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent." The one aspect that I'll never get over is how they use psychology against us. Sigmund Freud proved that broken relationships and imposed sexual repression can be used as a weapon, spreading emotional contagions and arousing primitive emotions in targeted populations. Emotions can simultaneously be used to build entire mythic systems. But the thing is that just outside London, the Tavistock Institute is a sloganeering nerve center of a global psy-war apparatus, one that attacks our collective conscious and unconscious relentlessly. However, it is more than just an international institution. The Tavistock Institute became a non-local community of practice, a dark, invisible college. Now, if you were going to think about it as in the concept of a family tree, while the Tavistock Institute's grandmother is the drug empire of the British East India Company, and the theosophical esoterics of Aleister Crowley, Helena Blavatsky, and Alice Bailey, its grandfather is the open conspiracy by H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Cecil Rhodes, and the Fabian Socialists. I mean, the Society of Physical Research helped create the Fabian Society. Anyway, the Tavistock Institute is the paranoid child of the Leipzig and Frankfurt schools of critical thinking and behaviorism. The psychodynamics of Freud and Jung are its godparents, but Tavistock's birth mother is the propaganda front called the Wellington House, otherwise known as the Lie Factory. If you want to trace it back even further than that, one of Plato's tricks was forbidding the question. His Republic is a blueprint for tyrannical systemic philosophical control. The Big Lie, a hypnotic propaganda technique, is rooted in Plato's quote-unquote noble lie, the myth knowingly told by the elite to maintain social control. I mean, you can even think of it in a Luciferian duality, using time as their fulcrum. Tavistock's explorations in crafting reality became exploitation, selling utopian idealism to the left and patriotic homeland security to the right. Pitting them eternally against one another is a neocon racket that molds all political party themes. Divide and conquer is the name of the game, and the game is collapsing the traditional world. They employ both religious and secular currents in the same exact way. playing both sides against each other and against the middle in a classical Hegelian dialectic. And I quote, "The core of the belief in progress is that human values and goals converge in parallel with our increasing knowledge. The 20th century shows the contrary, though. Human beings use the power of scientific knowledge to assert and defend the values and goals that they already have. New technologies can be used to alleviate suffering and enhance freedom. They can and will also be used to wage war and strengthen tyranny. In the 20th century, these technologies were used to implement state terror and genocide on an unprecedented scale. Ethics and politics do not advance in line with the growth of knowledge, not even in the long run." Now let's have a quote from Brzezinski, and I quote, "The technocratic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by the elite, unrestrained by traditional values." That comes from his book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era. But here's a quote from George Orwell. "Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind." Now, I have one more quote, okay? This is from H.G. Wells from The New World Order in 1939. "Countless people will hate the New World Order and will die protesting against it. When we attempt to evaluate its promise, we have to bear in mind the distress of a generation or so of malcontents. This is exactly their thinking in regards to the Great Reset. A couple generations of malcontents, and then their New World Order will flourish." The thing is that the Tavistock Institute's agenda is really used to create and topple governments. Entire populations are controlled through drugs and sophisticated psychological techniques. Disciplines include anthropology, economics, organizational behavior, political science, psychoanalysis, psychology, and sociology. The real crisis is the war conducted inside your head by those who do not have your best interest at heart, by those who program you for exploitation while robbing you of your rights and freedoms. Events take place along a utopian or dystopian spectrum, which ranges in the individual from euphoria to dysphoria. Look, underlying forces are playing your underlying forces, modulating your moods like an emotional organ. Conflict, fear, and trauma are used to manipulate and control individuals and whole populations. Once you come to understand that, politics will become much more clear. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. Make sure you disobey those true fascistas and the propagandists. But of course, I hope you have a good night.